The Calrathi Grand Fleet had never experienced failure. For 3,000 cycles, they had swept across 17 sectors of the galaxy, assimilating lesser species into the collective with methodical precision. Their technology was unmatched, their tactics refined through countless conquests. When their long-range scouts detected signs of industrial civilization in System J-7749, what the natives called Sol, the War Master Council didn't even bother convening a full session. Fleet Commander Zarkith reviewed the preliminary scans from his command throne aboard the dreadnought Eternal Dominion. The third planet showed all the hallmarks of a pre-FTL civilization just beginning to explore its own star system. Radio signals cluttered the electromagnetic spectrum with their primitive communications. Chemical rockets crawled between their moon and homeworld. Perfect. The humans would make adequate labor stock, and their world possessed abundant resources worth harvesting. Zarkith dispatched a standard first contact flotilla, 6 destroyers, 2 heavy cruisers, and a carrier with 3 wings of assault craft, more than sufficient to demonstrate overwhelming force and achieve immediate surrender. The collective had refined this dance across hundreds of worlds. As the flotilla translated from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, Tactical Officer Vexner began running standard reconnaissance sweeps. The results appeared exactly as expected. Crewed satellites orbited the major planets. A handful of interplanetary vessels drifted on ballistic trajectories between worlds. Nothing registered above Class 2 on the Technology Index. He transmitted the all-clear to Fleet Commander Zarkith and ordered the flotilla to proceed in system at combat cruising speed. The flotilla had barely crossed the orbit of the outermost planet when Vexner's sensor suite went completely dark. One moment, his displays showed clean tactical data across all frequencies. The next, every screen filled with cascading error messages. Electromagnetic sensors flatlined. Gravitic detectors reported impossible readings. Quantum state analyzers simply crashed. Vexner had served in the Grand Fleet for 40 cycles and had never seen a complete sensor blackout outside of dedicated jamming exercises. Before he could report the malfunction, his proximity alarm shrieked. Something was right on top of them. Visual sensors, the only system still functioning, captured an image that made no sense whatsoever. A vessel hung in space less than 500 meters from the destroyer Relentless Fury. But it shouldn't exist. It couldn't exist. The ship was enormous, easily matching the mass of a Calrathi heavy cruiser, yet built with what appeared to be welded metal plates. Crude ballistic weapons bristled from rotating turrets along its hull. Primitive reaction drives glowed at its stern. Everything about it screamed pre-FTL technology, yet somehow this massive warship had appeared in their midst without triggering a single sensor. Across the flotilla, similar reports flooded in. Each ship had found itself face-to-face with human warships that had materialized from nowhere. Fleet Commander Zarkith's command channel erupted in confusion as his officers tried to make sense of the impossible tactical situation. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison watched the alien fleet's formation disintegrate from the bridge of the battleship Wyoming. As the Terran Defense Fleet's tactical officer, he'd spent the last 6 months working on this exact scenario. The alien flotilla had reacted precisely as Admiral Patricia Nguyen predicted they would. Confusion, disarray, sensor blindness. The secret wasn't actually a secret at all, just a quirk of human technological development that nobody had thought to weaponize before. Humanity had developed advanced stealth technology not for spacecraft, but for submarines and aircraft. When engineers started building warships for deep space, they'd simply scaled up existing radar-absorbent materials, thermal baffling, and electromagnetic signature suppression. Not because they expected to fight stealth battles in space, but because it made targeting exercises more realistic. Nobody knew if it would work against alien sensors. The aliens' first mistake was assuming humans were pre-FTL. The second was assuming human technology would follow the same development path as everyone else's. The truth was messier and far more dangerous. Humanity had achieved faster than light travel through sheer mathematical stubbornness, cracking the underlying physics through university-funded research rather than discovering ancient artifacts or inheriting technology from elder races. The first FTL drive prototype had been built in a converted warehouse in Nevada by a team led by Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, who'd originally been trying to prove that warp field theory was impossible. She'd instead stumbled onto a method that worked, though nobody could fully explain why. What followed was the most chaotic period of technological development in human history. The discovery that FTL travel was possible unlocked funding for thousands of related projects. Corporations, nations, and research institutions all rushed to capitalize on the new frontier. Unlike species who received technology from established galactic powers, humans had to invent everything themselves. They made mistakes, hit dead ends, and occasionally stumbled onto solutions that shouldn't work, but did anyway. The result was warships that mounted railguns alongside particle beams, nuclear missiles next to plasma torpedoes, and kinetic impactors mixed with exotic energy weapons. Human military doctrine emphasized redundancy and adaptability above technological purity. If you couldn't hit a target with directed energy, you could always throw a solid chunk of tungsten at it fast enough to crack a planet. The ships looked like patchwork nightmares because that's exactly what they were, cobbled together from every promising technology humanity could develop or steal. Admiral Nguyen had understood the implications immediately when first contact protocols were established. If humanity's technological development was unconventional enough to surprise other species, that surprise could be weaponized. She'd spent years developing what her staff called the Ghost Protocol, preparing the defense fleet for the day when humanity's strange technological evolution would face its first real test. Commander Morrison adjusted his tactical display, watching as the alien ships tried to re-establish their formation. Without reliable sensors, they were essentially flying blind. The Wyoming and her sister ships held position, active stealth systems making them nearly invisible to conventional detection methods. The Terran defense fleet had been positioned in the outer system for 3 weeks, watching and waiting as the alien flotilla approached. Every approach vector had been calculated. Every possible response had been war-gamed. Now came the critical moment. Admiral Nguyen wanted to open communications, but from a position of undeniable strength. Let them understand that their sensors weren't malfunctioning. Let them understand that humanity had been watching them since they crossed the heliopause. Let them understand that first contact would happen on human terms. Fleet Commander Zarkith forced himself to remain calm as contradictory reports flooded his command center. The human ships were transmitting on radio frequencies now, the same primitive electromagnetic signals his scouts had detected weeks ago. But the message itself was anything but primitive. It arrived in perfect Kalrathi trade dialect, complete with proper honorifics and grammatical structures that took most species decades to master. The message was simple: reduce velocity and hold position for dialogue or face immediate military action. The audacity of it almost made him laugh. A primitive species threatening the Grand Fleet. Impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. Somehow, these humans had infiltrated his formation, positioned warships within striking distance of every vessel, and done it all without triggering a single alarm. His tactical officer Vexner had finally managed to get partial sensors online, though the readings made no sense. The human ships showed minimal electromagnetic signatures, almost no thermal output, and gravitic profiles that suggested they massed far less than visual observation indicated. It was as if they'd wrapped themselves in holes in space itself. When Vexner tried to get a targeting lock, the computers simply refused, insisting that no valid targets existed at the coordinates where human vessels clearly floated. Zarkith made the only logical decision. He ordered the flotilla to hold position and opened a communication channel. Protocol dictated that first contact with unknown species required careful assessment before military action. The collective had rules, procedures developed over millennia of expansion. He would follow them, gather intelligence, and then make an informed decision about how to proceed with these bizarre humans. The negotiations took place over the next 18 hours, conducted via holographic transmission between the Eternal Dominion and the human flagship Wyoming. Zarkith found himself facing Admiral Nguyen, a small female human with gray hair and eyes that suggested she'd seen more combat than her apparent age would indicate. She spoke flawless Calrathi and demonstrated an unsettling understanding of collective military doctrine. The conversation revealed uncomfortable truths. Humanity had detected the Grand Fleet's arrival in their system weeks ago, using what they called passive deep space telemetry arrays. They tracked the flotilla's every movement, analyzed communication patterns, and even intercepted and decoded tactical transmissions. While Zarkith had assumed he was dealing with a primitive pre-FTL species, the humans had been dissecting his force composition and running combat simulations. More disturbing was the revelation that humanity had achieved FTL capability nearly 20 years ago and had been quietly exploring neighboring systems. They'd encountered 3 other species, all of whom had described the Calrathi collective in unflattering terms. The humans had spent the last decade preparing for this exact scenario, building a military force specifically designed to counter what they'd learned about collective tactics and technology. Admiral Nguyen laid out humanity's position with brutal clarity. The Sol system was closed to collective expansion. Humanity had no interest in joining the collective, submitting to collective authority, or allowing collective vessels to operate in human space. If Zarkith withdrew his flotilla immediately, this encounter could end peacefully. If he chose to escalate, humanity was prepared to demonstrate exactly why their unconventional approach to warfare made them dangerous opponents. Zarkith's pride as a fleet commander warred with his survival instincts. The collective did not negotiate with inferior species. The collective did not retreat from primitive civilizations. Yet everything about this situation violated standard patterns. He needed more information, needed to understand exactly what he was facing. He made a decision he would later regret. Instead of withdrawing to report this anomaly to the War Master Council, he ordered his flotilla to deploy into combat formation. Perhaps the humans were bluffing. Perhaps their stealth technology was their only advantage. Perhaps a demonstration of collective firepower would force them to reconsider their arrogant position. He certainly wasn't going to be the first fleet commander in 3,000 cycles to retreat from a pre-FTL species without even attempting to assert dominance. Commander Morrison watched the alien ships begin to maneuver. Admiral Nguyen had given them every chance to withdraw peacefully. Now they would learn why humanity's chaotic approach to technological development had produced such devastating results. The Wyoming's weapons systems came online in a cascade of ready indicators. Railguns charged, missile tubes flooded, particle beam arrays energized, and kinetic impactors moved into launch position. Every system was redundant, every targeting solution calculated through 3 independent computers. The defense fleet had trained for this scenario until every officer could execute it in their sleep. What happened next would later be studied in military academies across human space as a perfect example of shock tactics. The Terran Defense Fleet didn't just drop their stealth systems, they lit up every active sensor and targeting system simultaneously. For the Calrathi flotilla, still struggling with sensor failures and contradictory readings, it was like going from complete darkness to blinding daylight in an instant. Suddenly, Calrathi sensors could detect everything. Dozens of human warships that had been invisible moments ago now blazed across every spectrum. Massive battleships, agile destroyers, carrier groups with wings of fighters already deployed. The humans hadn't positioned a few ships near the flotilla. They'd surrounded it completely, creating an overwhelming tactical advantage that made escape impossible. Tactical Officer Vexner's displays finally showed accurate readings, and what they revealed made his blood run cold. The human fleet outnumbered and outmassed the Calrathi flotilla by a factor of 3. Worse, their weapons were already locked on, firing solutions calculated and transmitted to every ship. If shooting started, the flotilla would be obliterated before they could mount an effective defense. Fleet Commander Zarkith stared at his tactical display, trying to process the impossible situation. The humans had been toying with him from the start. Every calculation, every assessment, every assumption had been wrong. This wasn't first contact with a primitive species. This was a trap, sprung with clinical precision by a military force that understood exactly what they were doing. Admiral Nguyen's voice came through the comm channel one final time. Her tone hadn't changed, still calm and professional, but the message carried absolute finality. Stand down immediately and prepare to receive boarding parties for inspection, or the defense fleet would interpret any further hostile action as an act of war. Zarkith had exactly 60 seconds to decide. The Kalrathi fleet commander had faced combat before, had made impossible decisions under fire, had seen ships under his command destroyed in battle. But he'd always known the odds, always understood the tactical situation. This was different. This was fighting blind against an enemy who saw everything, commanded superior numbers, and had already demonstrated their ability to completely dominate the battlefield. He gave the order to stand down. Engines powered down across the flotilla. Weapon systems went into safe mode. Shield generators maintained defensive configurations but didn't charge for combat. It was the most humiliating moment of his career, surrendering without firing a shot to a species the collective had assumed would be an easy conquest. Human boarding teams arrived within minutes, moving with the practiced efficiency of Marines who'd conducted hundreds of similar operations. They were professional, thorough, and surprisingly courteous. They inspected every ship in the flotilla, cataloging weapon systems, reviewing navigation logs, and interviewing crew members. Throughout the process, they maintained complete control, making it clear that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Captain Danny Sullivan led the team that boarded the Eternal Dominion. He'd grown up in Boston, joined the Navy at 18, and transferred to the newly formed Space Force when FTL travel became viable. Now he stood on the bridge of an alien dreadnought, face to face with a fleet commander who'd probably conquered more star systems than Sullivan had visited planets. Zarkith studied the human officer with undisguised curiosity. Captain Sullivan was young by Kalrathi standards, yet carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd seen serious combat. His equipment was a bizarre mixture of technologies, just like the human ships. Advanced tactical computers mounted alongside what appeared to be chemically propelled sidearms. Powered armor that somehow integrated both energy shields and reactive plating. The inspection revealed something that made Zarkith's situation even worse. Human engineers tore through Kalrathi systems with disturbing familiarity, identifying weaknesses and vulnerabilities that shouldn't be obvious to a species encountering this technology for the first time. When he finally asked how they'd learned so much about collective vessels, Captain Sullivan's response was matter of fact and terrifying. Humanity had captured a collective scout ship 7 years ago during a border skirmish in a neighboring system. The collective had written off the loss as a minor incident, attributing it to equipment failure. In reality, humans had ambushed the scout using the same stealth tactics they'd just demonstrated. They'd spent years reverse engineering every system, studying every design choice, and identifying every possible exploit. More importantly, they'd learned how collective sensors worked and specifically how they could be fooled. Kalrathi detection systems were incredibly sophisticated, but optimized for efficiency and standardization. They assumed all civilizations developed technology along similar paths, following predictable patterns. Human stealth systems worked because they violated those assumptions completely, presenting sensor profiles that didn't match any known classification. After 6 hours of inspection, Admiral Nguyen arrived aboard the Eternal Dominion for a final conversation with Fleet Commander Zarkith. They met in a conference room cleared of everyone, except a pair of armed Marines who stood silent guard at the entrances. Nguyen dismissed the formalities and got straight to the point. Humanity had no interest in conquest or expansion into collective space. They simply wanted to be left alone to develop their civilization according to their own values. But if the collective insisted on viewing them as potential subjects for assimilation, humanity was prepared to demonstrate exactly why that would be a catastrophic mistake. The defense fleet surrounding his flotilla represented less than 15% of humanity's total military strength. The rest was distributed across fortified positions throughout Sol's system and in several neighboring systems that had joined humanity in a mutual defense pact. If the collective escalated this situation, they would find themselves fighting a species that approached warfare with the same chaotic innovation that characterized all human endeavors. Nguyen pulled up holographic displays showing human weapons systems Zarkith had never imagined. Kinetic kill vehicles that could accelerate to significant fractions of light speed, nuclear-pumped laser arrays, antimatter warheads, relativistic projectiles, self-replicating minefields, autonomous hunter-killer drones. Some of the technology was advanced beyond anything the collective possessed. Other systems were deliberately crude, weapons so simple and brutal they'd been abandoned by more civilized species millennia ago. But the most disturbing revelation was humanity's approach to asymmetric warfare. They'd studied the collective's expansion patterns, identified logistical vulnerabilities, and developed specific strategies to exploit them. If full-scale war erupted, humans wouldn't try to match the grand fleet ship for ship. They'd attack supply lines, target infrastructure, and wage a guerrilla campaign across dozens of systems simultaneously. Their stealth technology meant they could position forces anywhere without detection. Their unconventional weapons meant collective defenses designed for conventional warfare might prove useless. Their cultural inclination toward independent thinking and adaptation meant they'd constantly evolve tactics in response to collective countermeasures. In short, humans would be a nightmare opponent, the kind of enemy that turned wars of conquest into endless quagmires. Zarkith listened to all of this with growing dread. The collective had encountered resistant species before, had fought wars of varying intensity across its expansion, but those conflicts had followed predictable patterns. Both sides understood the rules, operated within similar technological frameworks, and eventually reached negotiated settlements. Humanity rejected the very concept of those rules. They'd built their entire military philosophy around being unpredictable, unconventional, and absolutely ruthless when defending what they considered their sovereign territory. Admiral Nguyen made her final offer. The flotilla would be released unharmed and allowed to return to collective space with a complete sensor log of this encounter. Zarkith would report to the War Master Council exactly what had happened, including humanity's message that Sol's system and its allied territories were off limits. In return, humanity would refrain from taking offensive action against collective holdings and would maintain the current buffer zone between their respective spheres of influence. However, if the collective chose to escalate, if they sent more ships or attempted to establish a foothold in human space, the consequences would be severe. Humanity had spent years preparing for this confrontation. They had plans, resources, and most importantly, the will to fight a war that would make the collective's previous conflicts look like minor border disputes. The fleet commander knew he had no real choice. His flotilla was captured, his forces outmatched, and his assumptions shattered. He agreed to Admiral Nguyen's terms and began the humiliating process of preparing for withdrawal. As human boarding teams departed his ships, Zarkith found himself wrestling with questions that would haunt him for the rest of his career. How had the collective's intelligence services failed so completely? How had humanity developed such advanced capabilities while appearing to be a primitive pre-FTL civilization? More importantly, what other surprises did these unpredictable humans have prepared? The sensor logs from this encounter would revolutionize collective understanding of technological development, forcing military analysts to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how civilizations evolved. 3 weeks later, Fleet Commander Zarkith stood before the War Master Council in the collective's capital, transmitting his complete report. The chamber fell silent as he played sensor recordings that showed human warships materializing from nowhere. demonstrated how their stealth systems had completely neutralized collective sensor superiority, revealed the extent of human military preparation. The Council's reaction split along predictable lines. Hardliners demanded immediate retaliation, insisting the collective couldn't allow a primitive species to dictate terms. Moderates urged caution, pointing out that humanity's unconventional capabilities made them a uniquely dangerous opponent. Analysts requested time to study the sensor data and develop countermeasures. The debate raged for 6 cycles before the Council reached a decision. The collective would classify Sol's system and its allied territories as a restricted zone. No military vessels would approach within 50 light-years without explicit Council authorization. Intelligence services would focus on gathering more information about human capabilities through passive observation. Most importantly, the collective would avoid any action that might be interpreted as hostile until they better understood what they were dealing with. It wasn't surrender, but it was something the collective had never done before. Retreat. Recognition that a species they'd intended to conquer actually posed a legitimate threat. Acknowledgement that 3,000 cycles of military superiority didn't guarantee victory against an opponent who refused to play by established rules. Back in Sol's system, Admiral Nguyen reviewed her own reports with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The Ghost Protocol had worked perfectly, achieving its primary objective of forcing the collective to recognize humanity's strength without actually going to war. But she understood this was only the beginning of a much longer game. Humanity's advantage wouldn't last forever. The collective would adapt, develop countermeasures, and eventually find ways to neutralize human stealth technology. The element of surprise that had made this confrontation so one-sided would fade as both sides learned more about each other. When that happened, when the collective finally decided to test humanity's resolve with serious force, the real war would begin. But for now, humanity had bought itself time. Time to strengthen alliances, improve defenses, and continue developing the chaotic, unpredictable technologies that made them such a frustrating opponent. Time to prepare for the day when stealth and surprise would no longer be enough, when they'd have to prove that human innovation could match collective numbers in sustained warfare. Commander Morrison stood in the Wyoming's observation deck, watching as the Calrathi flotilla accelerated out of the system. The alien ships moved in tight formation, maintaining perfect discipline even in retreat. He respected that. Whatever else could be said about the collective, they were professional soldiers who understood when they'd been beaten. The real question was whether this peaceful resolution would hold. Humanity had demonstrated strength, but strength alone didn't guarantee peace. History, both human and apparently galactic, was full of examples where initial defeats only hardened resolve. The collective might decide that humanity was too dangerous to be left alone, that the only solution was overwhelming military action before humans grew even stronger. Or they might decide that conquest wasn't worth the cost, that humanity's offer of peaceful coexistence was preferable to a war that would devastate both sides. Morrison hoped for the latter but prepared for the former. That was the human way. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and maintain the capability to make any aggressor seriously regret their decision. In the weeks following the Calrathi retreat, humanity's intelligence services intercepted fragments of collective communications. The sensor logs from the Sol system encounter were causing significant disruption in collective military planning. Fleet commanders were requesting new tactical protocols. Research divisions were scrambling to develop detection methods for stealth technology. Political factions were arguing about how to respond to this unprecedented situation. But the most interesting intercepts came from collective intelligence analysts. They'd begun studying human technological development in detail, trying to understand how a species could achieve such advanced capabilities while appearing primitive on conventional scans. Their conclusions were disturbing, at least from the collective's perspective. Humanity's chaotic approach to innovation wasn't a weakness to be exploited. It was a fundamental strategic advantage that made human technological evolution unpredictable and difficult to counter. While the collective refined existing technologies along established paths, humans threw everything at the wall to see what stuck. The result was a technological portfolio that defied categorization and consistently produced unexpected capabilities. More worrying from the collective's perspective was humanity's cultural resistance to assimilation. Other species the collective had conquered typically shared certain universal values that made integration possible. Humans appeared to actively celebrate contradiction, diversity, and disagreement. Their entire civilization was built on competing ideas, conflicting philosophies, and constant debate. How could you assimilate a species that couldn't even agree among themselves what their core values were? The collective intelligence assessment concluded that humanity represented a unique challenge, not necessarily more advanced than the collective, but different in ways that made conventional military and political strategies ineffective. The recommendation was clear. Avoid direct confrontation until better intelligence could be gathered and appropriate countermeasures developed. Admiral Nguyen read the intercepted assessment with grim satisfaction. Humanity's strategy was working exactly as intended. They'd positioned themselves as too dangerous to attack casually, but not threatening enough to justify the massive military commitment that conquering them would require. It was a delicate balance, one that would require constant vigilance to maintain. She called a meeting of her senior staff to discuss long-term strategy. The Ghost Protocol had bought them breathing room, but that room wouldn't last indefinitely. Humanity needed to use this time wisely, strengthening their position before the collective decided to test their defenses again. Captain Sullivan, recently promoted for his role in the boarding operations, proposed an aggressive intelligence-gathering campaign. Human stealth ships could penetrate collective space, observe their military buildup, and provide early warning of any hostile intentions. It was risky, but the alternative was waiting blindly for the collective to make their next move. Commander Morrison argued for accelerating weapons development. The stealth advantage wouldn't last forever. When the collective developed countermeasures, humanity needed to have new surprises ready to deploy. That meant pushing research into more exotic technologies, even ones that seemed impractical or dangerous by conventional standards. Dr. Rodriguez, who'd been quietly observing the discussion, made a suggestion that silenced the room. Instead of just preparing for war, what if humanity focused on making war unnecessary? The collective expanded through conquest because they believed it was the most efficient path to galactic dominance. What if humanity could demonstrate a better alternative? Her proposal was radical. Use humanity's diplomatic capabilities to forge a coalition of species who opposed collective expansion. Not a military alliance necessarily, but an economic and cultural bloc strong enough to make conquest prohibitively expensive. Show the collective that cooperation could be more profitable than subjugation, that diverse civilizations working together could outcompete homogeneous empires. Admiral Nguyen listened to all three proposals and made a decision that would shape human foreign policy for the next century. They would pursue all three strategies simultaneously: intelligence operations to monitor collective activities, weapons development to maintain military deterrence, diplomatic outreach to build alliances and demonstrate alternatives to conquest. It was quintessentially human approach. Refuse to choose between competing strategies when you could attempt all of them at once. Embrace complexity and contradiction as strengths rather than weaknesses. Trust that somewhere in the chaos of multiple simultaneous efforts, solutions would emerge that nobody could have predicted. 6 months after the first contact incident, human diplomatic vessels began appearing in neighboring systems. Unlike military ships operating under stealth, these vessels deliberately announced their presence, broadcasting messages of peaceful intent and offers of technological exchange. They carried trade goods, cultural artifacts, and proposals for mutual cooperation. The response was cautious but encouraging. Species who'd been forcibly assimilated into the collective centuries ago saw humanity's defiance as proof that resistance was possible. Independent civilizations worried about future conquest viewed humans as potential allies. Even some collective member species began questioning whether expansion through military force was truly necessary. Meanwhile, human stealth ships conducted reconnaissance deep in collective territory, gathering intelligence on military capabilities and political dynamics. What they discovered was both encouraging and troubling. The collective was indeed preparing for potential conflict with humanity, but that preparation was creating internal stress. Resources diverted to military buildup meant less available for governance. Political factions argued about whether humans truly posed a threat, or whether the Warmaster Council was overreacting. Most importantly, human intelligence confirmed that the collective's expansion had been slowing even before the Sol system incident. They'd conquered most of the easily accessible territory in their region of space. Further expansion would require confronting species who'd had time to prepare defenses or pushing into regions with fewer valuable resources. The age of easy conquest was ending, and the collective leadership was struggling to adapt to that reality. Humanity's existence as a successful resistant species was forcing the collective to confront uncomfortable questions about their entire imperial model. If conquest was becoming more difficult and expensive, what justified the massive military infrastructure the collective maintained? If diverse civilizations could cooperate peacefully for mutual benefit, did assimilation actually create the efficiencies the collective claimed? These questions didn't have easy answers, and the collective's rigid political structure made adapting to new circumstances difficult. While human civilization thrived on debate and change, the collective had built itself around stability and uniformity. The very characteristics that had made them effective conquerors now made them vulnerable to unexpected challenges. A year after first contact, Fleet Commander Zarkith found himself assigned to defensive duties in the collective's core territories. It wasn't officially a demotion, but everyone understood what it meant. Officers who encountered unexpected resistance didn't get prestigious commands. He spent his days running routine patrols and training exercises, watching as younger commanders prepared for conflicts that might never come. He still thought about the humans often, wondered how they were developing their civilization, whether their chaotic approach would ultimately prove sustainable. Part of him hoped for another confrontation, a chance to redeem himself against the species that had so thoroughly defeated him. But a larger part recognized that such a confrontation would likely go even worse than the first. The humans had been preparing for the collective for years before that first encounter. How much more prepared would they be now, with additional time to refine their advantages? What new surprises had their unpredictable innovation produced? Perhaps the Warmaster Council's decision to avoid confrontation wasn't cowardice but wisdom. Admiral Nguyen retired from active service 3 years after the first contact incident, satisfied that she'd achieved her primary objective. Humanity had established itself as a power to be respected, not a target for conquest. The defense fleet had grown stronger, alliances had been forged, and the collective had shown no signs of renewed aggression. But she knew the work was far from complete. The next generation of officers would face new challenges as humanity continued to expand and interact with galactic civilization. The stealth advantage that had won the first confrontation would eventually be countered. When that happened, humanity would need new advantages, new innovations, new ways to surprise opponents who thought they understood human capabilities. Fortunately, producing unexpected innovations was what humans did best. Their chaotic approach to technological development, their cultural celebration of diversity and disagreement, their stubborn refusal to follow established patterns, all these characteristics that made them frustrating to conventional military analysis also made them incredibly dangerous opponents. The collective had learned that lesson the hard way when their sensors failed to detect human warships until it was too late. Other species would learn it in different contexts, discovering that humans rarely did things the expected way. Some would view this unpredictability as a strength worth emulating. Others would see it as a threat requiring containment, but none could ignore it. Humanity's first contact with the Calrathi Collective had been brief, decisive, and ultimately peaceful, but its implications would echo across galactic civilization for generations to come. The age of easy conquest was over. Species who thought themselves invulnerable had discovered that assumptions about technological development could be dangerously wrong. And somewhere out there, humans continued innovating, adapting, and preparing for whatever challenges the galaxy might throw at them next. The warships that had broken every Calrathi scanner weren't going anywhere. They patrolled human space, defended allied systems, and served as permanent reminders that humanity had claimed its place among the stars. Not as subjects of some ancient empire, but as equals who'd earned their position through innovation, determination, and the willingness to fight for what they believed was right. The collective had wanted first contact to go a certain way, following patterns established over 3,000 cycles of expansion. Instead, they discovered that humanity had its own ideas about how first contact should proceed. And when human warships materialized from nowhere to enforce those ideas, even the mighty Calrathi Collective had learned to listen.